the global movement among Jewish people. It's also it's a huge part of the discussion here at the conference. Delegitimization. It seems almost that, if there was a 1975 UN declaration that Zionism is racism, it seems like 2011, the declaration is anti-Zionism is racism. Like, instead of going on the defense, now it's on the attack. We're saying, do you think that anti-Zionism is racism?
I think that, as I said, not all criticisms of Israel are either racist or anti-Semitic. Similarly, while I think that there are manifestations of anti-Zionism that are both racist and anti-Semitic, I think it's too simplistic to say that anti-Zionism per se is anti-Semitic. It may cross the line into being anti-Semitic where it ends up by saying Israel has no right to exist, or the Jewish people have no right to self-determination, or that the Jewish people, are not even a people. But if you want to criticize aspects of Israeli policy or practice, or you want to criticize aspects of Zionism and Zionist ideology, that to me is not racist or anti-Semitic. I think we've got to set up, certain boundaries where it does cross the line, because I'm one of those who believes strongly in not only in free speech, but in rigorous debate and discussion and dialectic and the like. And if you say too easily that if you say that everything is anti-Semitic, then nothing is anti-Semitic, and then we no longer can make distinctions.
I'm glad you said that, because that's just it. I've been having conversations about this very topic, trying to find out where the red lines are. Of course, everyone may have different ones. Maybe this parliamentary group in this report will have certain red lines. Maybe, the ADL will have a different red line. State of Israel government has a different red line. Netanyahu, Likud party has a different. But I'm trying to just have conversations about what those red lines are.
Yeah. Well, see, let me put it this way: that Israel, like any other state, is responsible, must be held responsible for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And the Jewish people do not deserve any privilege or preference before the law because of the Holocaust or Jewish suffering. And so you can criticize an Israeli policy or action, as having been, not only a violation of human rights and humanitarian law, but you can even say it was a war crime. It may be, as I say, distasteful to see that or witness that, but I don't regard that as being anti-Semitic conduct. I think that that's part of what I call rigorous criticism and discourse. But the problem, I would say, is not that Israel should be above the law. I mean, no one should wish that Israel should be above the law or above criticism, above rigorous. The problem, as I see it, is that Israel is being systematically, that's why I'm going back to where I go, systematically denied equality before the law. That's why I use legal or normative category. The problem is not that human rights standards should be applied to Israel. They should be, and they must be. The problem is that these human rights standards are not being applied equally to everyone else. The problem is not that Israel must respect human rights. She must, and she's obliged to do so. The problem is that Israel's rights deserve equal respect, not greater, equal respect. So the problem is really one of equality before the law. And when you single out Israel and the Jewish people for selected and discriminatory indictment or punishment, then you're crossing the line into that which I would say is no longer legitimate criticism, but it's the application of double standards. It's a denial of a due process. It's the denial of equality before the law. So I'm sorry for using all these legal terminology, but I operate out of that universe, and all I'm seeking is that Israel should be provided equal protection of the law. It's equality before the law.
Well,
that's it.
It's interesting that you say that about the issue of holding to a higher standard, or not, applying the same standard equally across the board. And because conversations that I've had, what comes up is, first of all, can you disqualify a point of view because of the other people holding it? For example, many Jewish people want to move to Israel. Okay? There are also many Christian people who want many Jewish people to move to Israel for their own reasons, so that the apocalypse can come and destroy Jesus and come down. So, but the fact that Christian people are Zionists, want Jews to move to Israel, does not disqualify Zionism. And by the same token, if there are people who are anti-Zionist because they're anti-Semitic, or who want Israel to not have a law of return that prefers Jewish immigration over other kinds of immigration because they are anti-Semitic and would like to see the destruction of the Jewish people. I don't think
this is a good point.
Yeah.
To me, it's legitimate criticism to critique the law of the return. I don't think that that's an anti-Jewish act. I mean, somebody may say, you're criticizing the law of return. That's a core foundational principle of a Jewish state, but it may be that people don't understand that other countries have laws of return and so on. Israel's not the only one. And so, to me, that's part of legitimate criticism. It may be born out of not knowing about laws of return, that other democracies have, etc. That's fine. I don't take that criticism that Israel's law of the return, is itself giving preferential access to Jews, and therefore it's undemocratic or what. I think it's a legitimate critique to make. I think it's a critique that if one learns more about it, one may not make the critique, but it's not anti-Jewish. Not anti-Jewish. If you say that, extend it to say, not only do I don't like the law of the return, not only do I don't think Israel should have it, not only do I think that the law of return is racist, and you can say that, to me, it's still not being racist. But if you say Israel should not be and should not exist, then you cross the line. So the law of the return is a good example, or a critique of the law of return, of legitimate criticism, even if it may be a foundational principle for the Jewish state. It's legitimate to criticize the law of the return.
Foundational principles are legitimate, or what are considered foundational principles are open game.
Yeah, and an anti-Zionist may be critical of the law of the return. I have no problem with that.
The anthem.
Fine.
Changing the flag.
That's legitimate criticism.
Burning the flag.
Even that. Yeah, that's also. When I say it's not anti-Semitic and it's not, I don't like it. It's
right, you don't have to say it's tasteful.
No, that's why I don't like it. I think it's distasteful, but within the realm of legitimate
democratic dialogue.
Yeah.
Free speech. So the funny thing that comes up, or one of the issues that comes up, I find also in conversations, is when human rights activists or advocates, let's say, take the Israeli government to task, or certain, ministers to task for carrying out X, Y policies that they deem to be, by their standards, to be racist or discriminatory. What I often hear is, why don't you criticize? I'm affecting a New York accent when I say it. I don't mean to say anything, but why don't you criticize Iran? Why don't you criticize Syria? Why don't you criticize Libya? The problem here is twofold, because I'm not going to go into Israel's purporting purports to not be a non-democracy. It purports to compare itself to the Western democracies, like the European Union, that it wants to participate in at various levels. But I don't mean that specifically. But number one, no one has all the time in the world to be engaged in every single kind of activism. I mean, even the United Nations bodies that are geared towards stopping manifestations of racism can't keep up with all the manifestations of racism. I think it's a bit of a red herring to kind of foist that responsibility on this, individual citizens who maybe are wanting to be active about their pet cause, to say that they first of all have to engage, in a criticism of all these other countries. So that's one issue. And the second issue is they may be Israeli. Obviously someone in Israel who's criticizing these policies they say are discriminatory, they're being localists. They're talking about their own government. Or if it's diasporic Jews, they are also being localists in the sense that they're, to the people that they consider their people, the public policy that is enacted by representatives of their own people. So the same criticism, can it be leveled? And if so, or if not, how do we define how many other countries you have to criticize before you're allowed to criticize Israel? Like, what's the basis by which we judge whether it's okay to criticize Israel, or we say, oh no, that criticism is one-sided, you're singling out Israel? How do we determine singling it out?
I'm going to give you some. First of all, Israel, in a sense, is a culture of argument. So, I mean, to me, almost there are no holds barred in terms of the domestic arena. You can be as critical, certainly Israelis can be, and are as critical as one can be of Israeli policy and practice. Now, supposing from outside of Israel there is a criticism of Israel, and supposing the people who do so are not also criticizing Iran, I think as part of the discourse and dialogue, you can raise the issue of double standards if you are holding only one country to task. But the issue is how it's done. So I would raise it, but that doesn't make them racist, or it doesn't make their criticism for that reason invalid. But where you got a situation where you not only just criticize Israel and not Iran, but where you say Israel is an apartheid state, and even then, that to me is distasteful, but still within the boundaries of argument. It's where you say because it's an apartheid state, it has to be dismantled. Then you've crossed the line into, as I say, a racist argument or an anti-Jewish argument, because then you're saying it has no right to be. And you're saying it's an international. It has
now lost its right.
So you're not just criticizing. You're not criticizing an Israeli policy or practice. You're not only saying it has apartheid policies. You're saying it's a criminal apartheid state that must be dismantled. Then, and in my view, you have crossed the line. Similarly, take a principle in international law of universal jurisdiction. Now, universal jurisdiction means that where a state or people commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, let alone genocide, then those people who commit those crimes are triable or prosecutable under by any other state or any other jurisdiction. That's fine. That was a principle that Israel invoked for why it prosecuted Adolf Eichmann. In other words, under the principle of universal jurisdiction, Israel has a right to try Adolf Eichmann for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. But where people single out only Israeli nationals and apply only to them the principle of universal jurisdiction, and they say, okay, if you travel to Spain, or you travel to Belgium, or you travel to Holland or UK or wherever, we're going to arrest you and try you for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and you're not initiating any such processes against anybody else in a world in which many war crimes against humanity, genocide is being committed, then you have to question whether this is not the singling out of Israeli nationals for selective and discriminatory treatment, of the application thereby of double standards, of the denial of equality before the law or equal protection of the laws, and then that is sliding into the delegitimization, and in its effect, if not in its intent, it may also be anti-Semitic.
And do we give the presumption of innocence to people when they make claims like that? And what I mean by that is, if someone makes a claim, let's say someone says, I believe that the current government of Israel, with its laws in principle and in the enforcement of them in practice, is practicing a form of akin to apartheid. Now, like you said, saying that could be from a place of anti-Semitism, and it could be a legitimate criticism. Now, do we presume that it's illegitimate, or do we presume that it's legitimate, and then where do we go from there? Do we give them a questionnaire? Do we say, okay, I'd like to ask you about your views. Do you also believe that, if Ehud Barak can be tried for war crimes, can Tony Blair, your fellow guest at this conference, can Henry Kissinger, your fellow guest?
That's the point is that some of the same people may also want to try Henry Kissinger and Tony Blair, okay? And then you can say, okay, I don't like what they're doing, but they want to try them all, okay? But when, for war crimes and crimes, and apply universal jurisdiction to all of them. But when across jurisdictions, they're only seeking to try Israeli nationals, and you've got what I would call a systematic singling out of Israeli nationals by reason of their being Israeli for prosecution, then this is coming close to the line of being, as I say, selective prosecution, denial of due process, denial of equality before law. I still would not call it anti-Semitic. I would just say that it is violating the canons of equality before the law, due process, equal protection of the laws. So I always begin from a framework of legal categories. I just seek to apply these principles of equality before the law and equal protection of the laws. It'll take a lot for me to move from that into calling it anti-Semitic. It'll have to say that state has no right to exist. Those Jews have no right to self-determination. The Jews are not a people, let alone that state must be destroyed and its people must be destroyed. So if I look at, and I've written about, what are the definitions of and categories of anti-Semitism. So I've gotten about 7 or 8 categories of anti-Semitism, but some are easy, others become more difficult, but it still takes a lot for me to put it into the category of anti-Semitism.
Okay, I understand you're on a panel.